And on this night, the police arrived, arrested us, without really telling us what exactly was wrong. They took us in, and for 2 nights we were in a police cell until we were released, pending further investigation. And we thought, okay, well, this investigation would lead to anything because we had done nothing wrong. And yet, after 6 months of continued cooperation after this, in August of 2018, we were arrested formally and formally charged with very serious crimes. There's no wrongdoing whatsoever until we finally end with the most important prosecution witness, the secret police commander, the very individual who drafted the case file against us 8 years ago.
And I remember I started talking to one older gentleman who was next to me, and he was telling me that he's there for research because he's writing a book about how so-called humanitarians are facilitating smuggling. And I was like, I asked him, how do you know about this? How do you know? It's like, everybody knows that. Welcome back to Fractured. Today, a topic very close to our hearts and probably hearts of all people who do any type of humanitarian work. Just about 2 weeks ago, a trial of 3 humanitarians ended in the court of Mytilene on Lesbos. And today, to discuss the details of this process is Sean Binder, one of the 3 humanitarians. Sean, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back.
Sean, I know that most people who listen to us work in humanitarian area and are very much committed or volunteering with the refugee cases, but there are some people who are not that familiar with your case. So I would like you to tell people at the beginning maybe who 3 humanitarians are and how did it actually happen that rescue and monitoring mission in the Mediterranean turned into some prosecutor charges?
Sure. Wow. Well, let's cast our mind way back in time to 2018, which is when all of this started. I joined a small Greek search and rescue NGO called Emergency Response Centre International, ERSI for short. It was operating on the island of Lesbos, which, as you know, was one of the primary entry points for people who sought asylum during the peak and then the trough of the so-called migration crisis. I joined ERSI because I have some civilian search and rescue training. I have rescue diving experience, for example. I'm comfortable on boats. And so as an organization, what we did was we could either respond out at sea, that is the Strait of Mytilene, the several nautical miles between Izmir in Turkey and Lesbos in Europe. Or, and this is more often, we responded to people who made landfall, people who would arrive in those small dinghies that we can all recall in our minds, these small dinghies overfilled with people, often without life jackets, making this journey in the dead of night. Oftentimes the person who's steering the boat has no experience with being in a boat before this, or perhaps even ever seeing the ocean before. And so it is in that context that we lent emergency medical assistance. We had a medical team, which is also based in the infamous and now burned to the ground Moria refugee camp, and then search and rescuers. We did this work, perhaps a little bit ironically with hindsight, hand in glove, that is to say, with complete cooperation with the Coast Guard and with the police authorities, and indeed with Frontex, which you'll all know is the European Border Force Agency. We would only go out to see if they requested that we do so, and oftentimes they did. In fact, the organization received a plaque, an award from Frontex for its work. We provided training to the police. For example, some officers couldn't do first aid until we showed them how, which you might think is quite concerning. for that agency. And then we would provide, as I said, blankets, water, medical assistance, or just a smile to people who had undertaken this very perilous journey across that body of water. The Free Humanitarians grows out of this ERCI organization because in February of 2018, myself and my colleague, we were arrested at around 3 a.m. one night. We were doing something called a spotting shift. And if you're familiar with Lesbos, you'll know that it has a kind of a peninsula at its southern tip. And at that peninsula, there is a small cliff face or a plateau. And it is from that plateau that every night for about 2 years until that point, me or someone like me would stand there from midnight to 7 a.m. just listening for the screams of people in distress, because often that is the only way that you will know that there is a boat in distress out at sea. And on this night, the police arrived, arrested us, without really telling us what exactly was wrong. They took us in, and for 2 nights we were in a police cell until we were released, pending further investigation. And we thought, okay, well, this investigation would lead to anything because we had done nothing wrong. And yet after 6 months of continued cooperation after this, in August of 2018, we were arrested formally and formally charged with very serious crimes.
Did you stay on Lesbos this whole time?
Yes, I did. In fact, I had remained on Lesbos for a total of, before my detention, for a total of 9 months. And we continued cooperating with the authorities when we were released, this pending further investigation, precisely because we thought this is just going to be some mix-up. I mean, the very people who arrested us relied on us to do search and rescue the months following that incident. I did briefly go home because unfortunately my grandmother passed away a few weeks before I was arrested again. But apart from that, I was on the island coordinating the search and rescue on the southern shoreline of Lesbos for ERCI and for the other organizations that were operating too. And then in August, as I said, we were detained again, and this time held in pretrial detention for many months, well, for 3.5 months, and charged with some of the most heinous crimes. And those included being part of a criminal organization. In fact, they say that I was the mastermind of it, or one of the masterminds, which I think is very impressive. Money laundering, smuggling, forgery, fraud, the illegal use of radio frequencies, and my personal favorite, spying. And because of the severity of those charges, it was deemed necessary to keep us, as I said, in pre-trial detention. And so I was moved to Chios Island, which has a formal prison on it. I was handcuffed to a murderer and taken over there and spent many months until eventually being released on bail. And to finally answer your question, who are the Free Humanitarians? Well, that was the group of friends and my family who, terrified of what might happen if they didn't spread the word, created this campaign and spoke about what was happening to us. Initially, no one listened. Then bit by bit, as human rights organizations and media organizations began to look over the case file and to realize that the charges were so preposterous, so empty, they came on board. And Free Humanitarians grew into not a very large, but also not a very small campaign to try and advocate for our release, of course, which eventually happened, and then our acquittal, which eventually happened, and in general, for a human rights focused border policy in Europe and indeed further afield, which continues to happen.
Sean, you mentioned that you cooperated during your rescue and monitoring mission, that you cooperated with the police, with Coast Guard, with Frontex. So the natural question would be, so what was different in the interpretation of the police to yours that they decided to arrest you? And what kind of evidence did they have to actually do that?
Yeah, and I was initially so certain when I was sitting in my prison cell, which was quite small but filled with 17 people, I was so convinced that I deserved to be in there. Because this is Europe, after all. This is Greece, the birthplace of democracy. I wouldn't be finding myself on the inside of a prison unless I had done something wrong. I must have done something wrong. And I kept asking my lawyers, well, I mean, is there something there? Did I by mistake do something? And they kept telling me, no, what you did was absolutely necessary. So the evidence, the supposed evidence against us to, for example, prove, as they would have it, the charge of smuggling, is the fact that we did search and rescue. The fact that boats filled with dinghies filled with migrants would cross the border, and that we would help them at some point on that journey. They say, well, they weren't doing search and rescue. What they were in fact doing is pretending to do search and rescue, all the while earning millions of euros through smuggling. The problem, of course, is that the Coast Guard knew that we cooperated. And in fact, at trial, the Coast Guard officers and the Coast Guard commander, even though they were prosecution witnesses, confirmed precisely what we had been saying, including with screenshots and physical evidence that we cooperated the entire time. The other aspect through which the police suggested that we must have been smugglers and also spies is because, and they say, we use encrypted communications services. When I was first detained, the inquisiting judge, she asked me, why were you using encrypted communications? Why are you trying to hide something from the authorities? And I had to explain, we're talking about WhatsApp. I used WhatsApp just as 2 billion others use WhatsApp. There's nothing incriminating about that. And in fact, the secret police commander of Lesvos Island, the precise individual who started this entire investigation and who was the main prosecution witness at the trial, was asked by the judge, do you use WhatsApp? And he said, yes. He says, does your family use WhatsApp? He said, yes. Does that make you or your family criminals? He said, of course not. Then why does that make these defendants criminals? And he had no answer for that. And so, in short, in answer to your question, even though you would think, given the severity of these charges, and given that we waited 7 years for this to conclude, there would be some hard evidence against us, there was absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm. Sean, I very frequently wonder, trying to get into the mindset of the prosecutor, of people who orchestrated this whole trial. I really wonder what is behind it. Is it political? Is it possible that people are just clueless, being devil's advocate here? Is it possible that they just really do not understand certain processes that are happening? What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but if I were to put myself in the mind of the police and the prosecutor, I suspect I would just see tumbleweeds. But being perhaps analytical about it, obviously we can't know what the initial prosecutor and the initial police investigators were truly motivated by, but we can look at what we know today, and we can also know what happened in the meantime. So we know today that there was never any evidence. Again, all they had was the fact that we use WhatsApp. That obviously doesn't make us criminals. We can prove that we cooperated every single time. So clearly we aren't criminals. So they must not have been really, truly motivated by any evidence, because there wasn't any. Well, what happened what happened from when we were first detained all the way to today? The day after our arrest, the civilian search and rescue efforts on the southern shoreline of Lesvos, they stopped. And I want to stress here that Lesvos might be a small island, but in the context of the so-called migration crisis, it is one of the primary areas in the entire world where a large concentration of asylum seekers travel through. And so it is an incredibly important part of the shoreline of Europe and the ocean around Europe where search and rescue needs to occur, and yet after arrest, it stopped. And you fast forward bit by bit over the years, more and more organizations stopped operating, not only in search and rescue, but in the humanitarian space, and not only in Lesbos, but across the European continent. And I suspect that this is not only a consequence of the prosecution against us, but very possibly the intended purpose of these kinds of prosecutions. And the reason I say that is when I was first detained and I told you that I was convinced I must have done something wrong, I wanted to understand why this is happening. And I read through policy papers by the European Union, and I read specifically through a Frontex risk analysis report from 2017, so the year before my arrest. And I read it in prison, and I came across this phrase called the pull factor. And what it says, the pull factor, and it was such an intuitive argument, I immediately thought, well, I must be guilty. Because what it says is that even if civilian search and rescue organizations are not purposefully part of a smuggling network, they are still enhancing smuggling by providing services that make it easier for smugglers to sell tickets to asylum seekers. Basically, the safer the water is, the more people will pass through that water. And it seemed so intuitive, I thought, okay, well, this must be true. And so that is why I think the authorities are trying to stop civilian search and rescue, because they think there is this correlation between civilian search and rescue and smuggling. The most devastating thing, I think, for that argument is that it is completely unsupported by any evidence whatsoever. And there has been about a decade of longitudinal research done on whether or not the more search and rescue have, the more people travel through a certain body of water to seek asylum. There's no evidence to support it. In fact, what is far more likely to be a correlation is if the weather is good. If there is no storm, then people will climb into boats. If the place they're leaving is so frightening that they don't want to stay, that is also a correlation, but it is not civilian search and rescue.
Sean, your trial lasted for almost 8 years. It's crazy. It's crazy, almost a decade being in this limbo. I hope I will not re-traumatize you too much if I ask you if there were some moments during this trial that you thought, oh, maybe it's gonna go south. Maybe, it's gonna collapse. It's not gonna work. I wonder if you had those moments of doubts that you may end up in prison with all the other people who were on trial with you.
Yeah, on several occasions, I think I didn't doubt the fact that what I did was right. And in fact, what I did was legal, if not a moral and legal obligation, a positive obligation to do search and rescue. I never doubted that. What I did start to doubt, and to be honest with you, continue to doubt, is that the European Union takes its rule of law obligations seriously, and that the European Union and its member states take their human rights obligations seriously. Because as these 8 years have dragged on, and it was we, the defendants, who begged the prosecutor to finally bring this to trial, and it is the prosecution that dragged its heels. In that time, we have seen a worsening migration policy response to people who are drowning in our oceans, not just in Greece, but across the European Union. And so in a nutshell, I never doubted what I did was the right thing to do. What I still doubt, is that Greece and the European Union will do the right thing. And I suspect we cannot take that for granted.
Yeah, I agree.
The reason, if I may for a moment, when we had our trial, we had several trial observers from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and local observers who specifically observe all smuggling-related trials on the islands. And what one of them said to me was that our case is not at all unique, and I completely agree with her. Our case isn't unique. There are scores of individuals, humanitarians, who are being prosecuted across the European Union today. In fact, the latest trustworthy data that I have seen for last year was that there were 140 individuals being prosecuted across the European Union. So it isn't really a unique case. Not to mention the many, many, many cases of asylum seekers who are charged with smuggling as boat captains. And what she said is not that our case is unique, because there is never any evidence of any wrongdoing in cases like this. And the charges are always dubious. The difference is that there were eyes in our case. Difference is that people watched our case. And that is why our rights were respected. And the most heartbreaking thing, of course, is that most of us don't care about asylum seekers who are charged with smuggling. I have met many people in prison who were convicted, who never had any observers at their trial. Or if they did, they never had any support, for example, a good lawyer or an interpreter. It is not at all unusual for on these islands to be cases where an asylum seeker is sentenced to 80 years in prison after a hearing, a trial that lasts 15 minutes. And they don't know that they have a right to appeal if their lawyer ever spoke to them at all. And so our case, although we were acquitted, is fantastic news for me personally. I don't think it means very much for the fight in general. And that is what is so disheartening, I suppose.
Yeah. Because with you, you're right that you were the most followed trial there was of humanitarians at a certain point. But there are so many people who, as you mentioned, were accused of smuggling just because they were forced to steer the boat. They were giving water on the boat, and this is considered being a smuggler because you have some things with you. So there are those like tiny things that you would never think can be considered a smuggling-like activity, but you still are accused of it. And I saw some statistics. It was actually on Free Humanitarians page that basically in Greece, those who are convicted of smuggling make up to the second largest group in prison in Greece. Which is something like 1 in every 5 prisoners. This is a person who is accused, was accused and sentenced of smuggling. And what also our students were telling me is that so many people who are in prison, who are asylum seekers and are imprisoned, arrested by either the Coast Guard or police, they do not want to make their case big. They do not want media there. They do not want to notify anybody because they are hoping that if they will cooperate and they will not make a big fuss of it, it will somehow go away, that they will realize that they do nothing wrong. There's nobody big behind them and it's all going to go away. But it is not happening for them.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And look, I understand the strategy and the hope that if we're just quiet, this thing falls away. But my fear is that as we have become more fear-driven, as we have shaped the conversation around migration, not in the framework of human rights, but in the framework of illegality and crimes, and I suppose a hard border regime, then the governments have kind of forced themselves to be seen to be doing something. They need to be seen as though they are responding to the smuggler problem as they have framed it. But of course, in the vast majority of cases, the people making an obscene amount of money by forcing people into horrible conditions in these tiny dinghies, people I don't at all agree with, who I think are doing awful things, those people don't get into those boats to drive those boats. They're not making that journey across in the vast majority of cases. It is someone who can't afford to pay the obscene smuggling fees, who negotiates into an agreement where, okay, I'll pay less and then I will steer the boat. But they are themselves a legitimate asylum-seeking individual who is not a smuggler, who is just worse off than the others because they have fewer resources to pay. And for that person then to be arrested is just a cynical use of the broadened interpretation of what smuggling is all just to be seen to be doing something rather than doing something effective. The irony, of course, is that you can achieve your policy goal of stopping smuggling and still respect human rights. And the way to do that is to provide safe and legal pathways to seek asylum. But of course, it was never about stopping smuggling. It was always about not having people exercise their right to seek asylum.
As sad as it is, it's just growing, this policy right now in the European Union. Sean, 8 years, almost 8 years in this battle. I wonder, what does this 8 years do to a human being, from like really a human perspective? You, your friends, almost 8 years of living in this limbo, paying for the lawyers. What does it really do to a person to be on a trial for almost 8 years, emotionally, financially, mentally?
Um, well, on the one hand, it has inflated my ego an obscene amount. I had a big head coming into this world, but it is even bigger now. I say that because, I'm making light, obviously, of an incredibly difficult situation for me and my co-defendants, but there is genuinely a part of me that has weirdly experienced a privilege. I am able to talk to you about an experience that I've had, yes, that was very, very negative, but that I definitely didn't experience alone. So many people have supported us, have written to us, have donated to us, have stood by us, have shared our content, have made sure that our case is, relatively well known. And that is an absolute privilege. And as I say, it has come with its massive ego boost, which I now have to deal with. And so, in some respects, I'm not happy it happened, obviously, but there is something to be said about the beautiful solidaristic community that I now get to be part of, and I hope to contribute to myself. And so focusing on that reminds me of the good things. Obviously, it hasn't all been good. I came to Lesbos as quite a young man. Now, 8 years later, I am no longer a young man, and yet I haven't really been able to develop my life in a direction that I suppose my friends have been able to do. Several of my friends have children now, have some savings, are able to experience a career that has grown around them for many years. What kind of father would I have been if I had a child and then went to prison for 20 years? That option only became open to me 2 weeks ago, which was wonderful. I mean, I'm grateful for it, of course, but there's also, a sense of time having been lost. I wasn't allowed to work. When I left prison, because I met so many people in prison who I felt didn't have a good lawyer or didn't even have access to a lawyer, I decided to retrain as a criminal defense lawyer. And so now I'm one of those wig-wearing lawyers here in London. And I've not been allowed to work. I'll return to work very soon, but I haven't been for quite a long time. And obviously that affects the experience that I've had professionally, but also the amount of money that I've been able to earn. Not to mention my family's mental health. My mother has suffered. I mean, she has been incredibly strong throughout this entire process. The reason that I survived, I think, even in the short time that I did in prison, is because she was there for me. My friends and family were there for me. But yeah, I think it's taken a real toll on my family's mental health as well. Now, all that is to say that I'm now going to start working, and I'm going to get therapy, and I'm going to find, some things to do as a 32-year-old man.
Sean, going back to this last trial on Lesbos, How did it look like? I'm really curious because everybody was following all the news coming from predominantly some legal organizations, but how did it look like? What was exactly said, and what was the final verdict?
This trial, which started on the 4th of December of 2025, was for the felonies, that is to say, for the very serious offences. By this time, we'd already bested the misdemeanors. So we were looking at a trial for the money laundering charge, the smuggling charge, and the membership of a criminal organization charge. So we knew going in that this one was the most important. There was 20 years sentence on the line. If found guilty, would have been immediate custody. And so the tensions were high when the prosecutor opened up his case. The first thing that happened is that the prosecution witnesses gave evidence. And the very first, and I mean, Sonia, the very first prosecution witness gave evidence. She was from the UNHCR, and she said, this case is the criminalization of humanitarian activity, precisely the terms how we have been describing our case for the past 7 years. And she said clearly in court, this was not a legitimate prosecution. And then the next prosecution witness came, the Coast Guard officer with whom we had cooperated all those years ago. Every single incident of smuggling, as the police alleges, we had cooperated with this one officer. And he verified, using evidence of screenshots of conversations with him, between the organization and him, that every single time there was a boat in distress, that we responded to it, we informed them precisely as we had been saying. And then the next witness was the Coast Guard commander, and he said exactly the same thing. And so we move through these prosecution witnesses, and it becomes clearer and clearer that there's bloody nothing. There's no wrongdoing whatsoever until we finally end with the most important prosecution witness, the secret police commander, the very individual who drafted the case file against us 8 years ago. And he is asked questions, and it becomes immediately clear that he can't explain why, as I said before, WhatsApp is criminal. He can't even explain where the border is between Lesbos and Turkey. He doesn't know where or when we communicated with the authorities. He says he had no idea. What became so clear by the end of the prosecution case is that this whole thing could have been resolved if the police commander had simply called the Coast Guard commander and asked the simple question, hey, I think these individuals are criminal because I think they didn't cooperate with you. Did they cooperate with you, Mr. Coast Guard Commander? And he would have said yes, and there would have been no need to prosecute us. But that conversation never happened. And so for 7 years, we've had to spend like €100,000 in legal fees and other campaign costs. We've spent years in limbo, unable to work. Search and rescue has stopped. People have literally drowned in the oceans where they may not have done if search and rescue had continued over the past couple of years, including up to a few weeks within the trial. And so by this point, we were livid because it was so stupid, but also relieved because we knew there was just no pathway to conviction. Nevertheless, they only allocated a few days for our trial in December, so we had to adjourn for 5 weeks, finally coming back on the 5th of January, so 2 weeks ago now. And on that day, we had this mammoth-long hearing for 12 hours. We had the courtroom discuss and deliberate our case. By the time it was my turn to give evidence, the judges were so disinterested. They asked me the most vague, bland questions. Why did you volunteer? What's your experience? Why did you use WhatsApp? What are you up to today? There was, I think, very clearly no thought on their part that we were guilty. And in fact, when then the prosecutor, which is a surprise for a person living in the English jurisdiction, recommended that we be acquitted, the judges were trying to hurry up the many defense lawyers who were giving their speeches saying, look, there's no point going through all of this. We all know what the answer will be. And sure enough, there was unanimous decision to acquit us. And I met that moment with obviously an immense relief. I did not want to go back to prison, but honestly also an immense anger. Because if this whole thing ended up being a joke, as it was, then this entire situation, including the lives lost, drowned in the Strait of Mytilene, including the fact that many organizations had to stop work, including that I have been unable to work and carry on with my life, was also a joke, was a complete waste of time. And so I have this very ambivalent feeling about it. Nevertheless, when we were then finally acquitted, my mother was there, my friends were there were so many organizations and journalists, and there was almost this party atmosphere. Somebody had smuggled in what I initially thought was fireworks, but happily was only very large confetti poppers, and someone even brought a bottle of champagne, which I didn't get any of, now that I think about it. In any case, we all went down for a swim down in the dark, and you'll know that Mytilene Court, of course, sits on this hillside. And if you go back down on the other side of the capital, so not towards Mytilene, but towards
the castle,
the old Moria camp, there's this marina, and we all swam in there. And like some of the defendants, our friends and families, some even journalists came in, trial observers. My two lawyers also went in. One, he stripped down to his boxers and hopped in, and the other was so upset that she was missing out. She jumped in her dress, and it was such an amazing moment to wash away these years of absolute rubbish and stupidity.
Sean, you know, when I remember those times on Lesbos when you guys got arrested, it was this big, like, what the hell moment for the whole humanitarian world, everybody who worked on Lesbos. Because I remember when I first arrived in 2017, I had such positive experiences with local government, with the police, because prior I worked in Serbia. And this was not a pleasant experience. You know, every time you would come across a police officer in Serbia, that was very problematic. And it didn't matter if you had all your documents in order, every possible permissions. The number of times that we were threatened with guns, you know, by police officers for literally in Serbia for literally distributing food to people. It was a very basic program. So when I came to Lesbos, it all seemed so easy and welcoming. You know, I started working in Karatepe, which was a pretty nice camp. If somebody has to stay in a camp, may it be camp like Karatepe. And then this thing happened to you. And I remember that we all just like, when like, how, what, why, like we couldn't really explain it. And there were some even rumors in the humanitarian world, I have to say, going like there must have been something. You must have done something because like it's Lesbos. It just wouldn't really happen here. And so nobody could really believe, you know, that that the authorities would just go with such serious accusations. And I think it really put this horrible pressure on all of us to be extremely careful. But how do you see it? Because right now, many organizations, as you said, they stopped working. Many were suspended. Some of them for different reasons, like financial. It's extremely hard to keep organizations going right now. But do you think that now this verdict of yours, it may change a little bit in how we operate, meaning we, the humanitarian world, in relation to local authorities? Do you think that search and rescue will now face less problems?
No, to cut a long story short, I'm afraid to say I don't think so. In fact, when I was the day after our acquittal, some of the defendants asked to meet up, and we did, and we sat in a little cafe, and one of them suggested, well, let's go back, let's do search and rescue, let's prove that we're allowed to do this. And perhaps it's my fear, I said I don't think that's a good idea. And the reason is that it's not only our case that matters for this context. Yes, our case might set a precedent, but only by the time you get to trial, only when there is a need for a verdict. It doesn't really help in mitigating against an overzealous police officer who arrests people, or a prosecutor beginning an investigation. That doesn't stop because of our verdict. It only has an impact once we get to trial. And as we know, it takes bloody years, almost a decade, to get to trial. So the damage will have been done, and I think the damage has already been done. As I said to my co-defendant then, a few weeks ago, I wouldn't go back because I think a search and rescue organization is now in an even more difficult position than we were. A search and rescue organization can now do one of two things. It can either cooperate with the authorities, as we did back then, but if it does so, then we know, because the situation has gotten so much worse, that it might cooperate in committing a crime. I'm sure you've covered this before, but illegal pushbacks occur on the islands of the North Aegean Sea. That is where masked authorities kidnap individuals, stick them into a little dinghy, break their boat engine, take their boat engine, cut their fuel line, or take their fuel tank, drag them back out to sea after beating some or many of them, and just leaving them drift. And that isn't just reports by small little hippy dippies like myself. That has been found in a recent judgment in the European Court of Human Rights, and I think the case is GRJ against Greece, which found, I'm paraphrasing now, reasonable grounds to believe that illegal pushbacks were happening on the Aegean Islands, that is to say, around Lesbos Island. And so an organization can either cooperate with the authorities and be complicit in these crimes, which would be completely against the humanitarian principle of do no harm, or it can not cooperate and open itself up precisely to the allegations and the charges that we faced, and if they don't cooperate, may well be found guilty, and so risk imprisonment. So I don't think there is a path back to search and rescue without many more things happening first. And that principle, the fundamental thing that needs to happen first, is that we convince hearts and minds that the rule of law still matters, that human rights matter even in the context of migrants. Even if we don't like migrants, they still are entitled to their basic human rights. We're not having those fundamental conversations. We're only having fear-driven conversations, which demonizes migrants, particularly irregular migrants like asylum seekers and refugees. And until we have just re-established the basic human principles of the rule of law that our democratic European Union is supposed to be based on, then I don't think we can reinvigorate search and rescue. I certainly think I wouldn't recommend that anybody goes back to do search and rescue because they face serious risk either of doing harm or of being imprisoned.
You know, for me, it was a really joyous moment when we all found out about the verdict. And then we started really wondering if, you know, the verdict is for us, for the humanitarian world. But we were wondering how would people of Mytilene, Lesbos, any small community really take it if they even learn about it. I remember this incident. It was right before COVID pandemics when Mare Liberum, which was a unit to monitor situation in the Mediterranean, they were not really doing search and rescue because the vessel was very old and would not be suitable for that. But they were just monitoring the situation. And I remember when they were trying to dock in Mytilene port, and some gasoline was poured on the ship. So they went back and tried to do it a second time, cooperating with the Coast Guard, of course, and so on. And there was a massive group of supporters, and there was a massive group of locals who were, again, yelling, shouting things, accusing them of facilitating illegal transfer of people, and so on. And I remember I started talking to one older gentleman who was next to me, and he was telling me that he's there for research because he's writing a book about how so-called humanitarians are facilitating smuggling. And I was like, I asked him, how do you know about this? How do you? It's like, everybody knows that. I was like, well, I'm interested in your book. What are the main theses? I was like, well, this is happening, and they're getting a lot of money. And how much? Like, and he said, like, oh, 10,000 per one go of people. I was like, so how did you learn about this? And his answer to every of my question was like, everybody knows it. Right? It wasn't even, oh, a friend told me or something like that. It's like everybody knows it. So as much of a success of this verdict is for you, for the humanitarian world, it saddens me because I really don't think it brings any change to those local communities that are impacted by the so-called refugee crisis. It doesn't change their views. It doesn't bring like any change in how they approach people who work with them, next to them. It doesn't change much even for the solidarity movement there. Whoever was in the solidarity bubble stays there. Whoever was outside of it, I believe, will stay there.
I agree, and I think that's what you're highlighting now, of course, isn't it the issue of polarization. You know, we have our bubbles, and you and I might be in one, and that gentleman and his everyone knows it is in another one, and we are just unable to communicate with each other. And I find that so frightening, because if we cannot have a conversation and agree on the basic principles that people shouldn't be drowning in the Mediterranean, then where does that leave us? Where does it leave our ability to build a society and to keep the rule of law maintained? I completely agree with you that I don't think it makes a massive difference. But I also think that the reason it's happened isn't because, and I'm sure you agree with me here, that the people of Lesbos aren't particularly racist or particularly bad or anything like that. If anything, there are still many people on Lesbos who are incredibly generous and kind. And they, as we know, were nominated for the Peace Prize because of their work. But if there has been a bitterness growing among lesbians, and indeed in other border regions, then I think it's because they feel disproportionately affected by this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like the policies, like the EU-Turkey deal, which locked down the islands of the North Aegean Sea, so that they became just literally disproportionately responsible for those many people who were coming to the islands. That would also make me upset after a period of time. I often reflect that, I grew up on the southwest of Ireland, facing out towards the Atlantic. The next landmass you would see would be the United States. If it were, as may well be the case soon, given how terrifying things are in the United States, people start taking dinghies across the Atlantic to seek refuge in County Kerry, where I grew up, then we might well initially be very giving and forthcoming. But after 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, we would also feel angry that perhaps Dublin wasn't doing enough to assist us, or Brussels wasn't doing enough to assist Ireland, in the way that Athens isn't doing enough to assist those islands, and Brussels isn't doing enough to assist Greece. And so I think what we need to do is to talk about how it isn't the fault of the asylum seeker, the refugee, who's doing, again, nothing more than the thing that they have a right to do, which is to seek protection. And that it is the fault of the policies which force people into these awful situations, including locals, of course. And if we don't do that, then we'll just see more cases like ours. My acquittal means nothing. It really means nothing to anyone except for me and my co-defendants. There are other cases being written now, being investigated now on Lesbos as we speak. There are individuals who I suspect will soon receive arrest warrants for their documenting work. Mara Liram is no exception. Of course, we know what happened there, but others who do the same monitoring work too. And so we must first achieve those fundamentals of agreement, reaching out to people as you try to do, and have that conversation as you try to do, to try and build a consensus, an agreement, some kind of basic truth, which we're losing, I think.
Sean, to end our conversation, I want to ask you for the plans of Free Humanitarians. Do you plan to still keep on going, working, advocating, or are you guys like done? You wanna live your lives, have a normal job, and just be free of all of this, and not be re-traumatized by all the stories that keep coming?
Well, I'd like to have a normal life and to keep Free Humanitarians doing, I think, possibly more relevant things. As I said a moment ago, the judgment has only really been helpful for me and my co-defendants, and Free Humanitarians has primarily focused on me and my co-defendants. And what we would like to do now, and what we're doing now, is we're trying to talk about this issue writ large, because of course it is a larger issue. It isn't just about our case. And so we are in the beginnings of managing a database. It is a database called Crimes for Solidarity, which keeps, at the very least, an archive of the cases of criminalization of humanitarianism and solidarity, not just in Greece or in Europe, but globally, and to try and tie the story together. So the hope is that this archive or database is useful for at least two reasons. One, that if you find yourself being prosecuted in a jurisdiction, you might be able to find in the database lawyers who've worked on other cases who might be able to assist you. You might be able to discover legal strategies that helped us, that might help you. And secondly, that we can advocate for this issue on a larger and more structural level, rather than just taking each case on its own. That is the hope that we have for Free Humanitarians now and in the medium term.
Any thoughts of going back to Greece and potentially working in Greece?
I'd like to retire in Greece. I've been robbed of my 20 years in a Greek island after my acquittal, and I want that island life. So hopefully I can eventually return to Greece. And no, I'm being light, of course, but honestly, I love Lesvos. I love the people of Lesvos. And I love the people of Greece and its food and its culture and its openness. And I'm sad that everything that's happened has happened, but I'm still very much in love with Greece and with its people, and will return often, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then that's my wish to you, to retire on one of the beautiful Greek islands, hopefully in many, many years.
Hopefully in many years.
Yeah.
Or very few years, actually. Yeah. Ideally soon. I don't know.
After a trial like this, I believe, that's the truth. Sean, thank you so much for being with us today and explaining this trial, and congratulations. And I hope you feel relieved, and now a completely new path will open for you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for taking the chance and the time to listen to me babble on for ages. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you very much for listening and watching. We will be back with another Humanitarian Watch, the whole fractured episode in 2 weeks' time.